Welcome to the broadcast. Oliver Stone is back, and with him he has brought Nixon. Always controversial, always on the edge, always prepared to grab history and shake it. Stone is our most political filmmaker. He is not afraid to tackle larger-than-life people and subjects. Some say he makes people think, others say the medium is so strong and its ideas so strong that he may be dangerous. He is not a historian, he is a filmmaker. He debunks myths and he makes myths. He is admired for his courage and disliked by some for his point of view and his creative license. Tonight, Oliver Stone on his Nixon and his films. Welcome.
Hi, Charlie.
How are you?
Good, good. It's been a while.
It has been. Tell me about Richard Nixon that you have brought to film. 3.5 hours plus that I saw last night.
What do you think?
I expected you to ask that. I liked it. I admired very much of what you had done. I thought all of the performances were both brilliant in the casting and in the performance, from Hopkins to Trevino, James Woods. They two of them who've been here. I would like to have seen, and it was intriguing to me to watch Richard Nixon, and I thought it was a slice of him. And I'm not troubled by some of what clearly you would be considered dramatic license, whether it's a scene on the bridge or whatever it is, doesn't trouble me. Here was a man that is intriguing to all of us who are political junkies, you and me, a dominant political figure of our time. I wanted to know more from this about what it was that made him great. There's a line in the film where he had an opportunity for greatness. I think you've forgotten who said it, What I saw was a man at the end of his time, essentially, with a glass in his hand and unraveling a lot. So I liked the film. I loved the performances. The direction, as always with an Oliver Stone film, is extraordinary.
Well,
but those are the
that's well
reservations
said.
I had.
Yeah, I understand that. I guess I'm glad you say it, because then we can get to the point faster instead of going on. I could go on about the movie, and then you'll raise the issue. I think that the line comes from Elliot Richardson, who I met in Washington with Tony Hopkins, and he leaned over. He's a Boston Brahmin, and his incomparable accent, he said, he had greatness in his grasp, but he had the defects of his qualities. Yeah. And I was like puzzled, and I'm thinking about the defects of his qualities, and I thought back to the same thing had been said to me earlier by Shimon Peres in Israel, who knew Nixon also as a younger man, and he said, the man was, which Nixon do you want to know about, the good Nixon or the bad Nixon? He says, the good Nixon. The very tools, the very weapons that he used to come from nowhere, from Wichita, California, and nobody, to rise to the very top of the American power structure, were the very weapons and tools that just destroyed him. It was, in a sense, the Greek irony, fate, anger, paranoia, the things that motivated him a large part of his life.
Outside.
And idealism. Although it was, in my view, a corrupted idealism, were the tools of his destruction. So in the concept of the movie, you're absolutely correct. We telescope back in time. The movie is basically structured around the last year of his presidency, and he is alone, he's isolated, he's in the Lincoln Room a lot of the time of the White House, and listening and living through his past, through the tapes. That was the concept of the movie. He has and is unraveling, absolutely. And in fact, we are historically correct. Most witnesses of that period point to a man who was unraveling.
And some of that is reported in Final Days.
Who was drinking on Final Days, Woodward and Bernstein, who was drinking, and who was also taking pills, by the way, and who went through a near-death situation with phlebitis. Major, almost near death, and apparently had to take medication to deal with it. And the medication would sometimes lead to slurring. But we don't ever suggest in the movie that he was out of control, ready to push the nuclear button, some kind of parody. No, the man was a very, actually moderate drinker, by all accounts, but 1 or 2 drinks, and especially in combination with pills, might easily set off a slurred reaction. But even in his drunken moments in the White House, very much a man in control. He uses, like my father did, drinking to relax himself from a very tense inner core. So the heights, the courage of the man, the greatness, all this is subject to debate. You could say he had greatness in his grasp. Yes, he had a vision of the world, and he explains it on the boat. I thought very succinctly, you know, we've got to hang in there in Vietnam. We're not going to lose this war. We're going to hang in Vietnam, and through that war, we're going to divide the Communist alliance. We're going to split China from Russia, and we're going to make separate deals with both. And I think that's a brilliant triangular diplomacy strategy. And I do believe he initiated it, not Henry Kissinger. And I believe he carried it out. China was a ringing success, and most people really underestimate the greatness of his move in Russia. He actually made SALT I treaty work. He had a great friendship, it seems, with Brezhnev, the premier, and was in the process of making SALT II. If Nixon had remained in office, it is my belief, in my opinion only, that we would have ended the Cold War in the second term, and that we would not have had Ronald Reagan and this huge military buildup we had in the 1980s. So that is the, in my mind, that is the greatness that I am referring to. But in his own life, where was the greatness? You know, we should talk about that. Where was the greatness in the Hist trial? Where was the greatness in the Chequers speech? Where is the greatness in all these crises that are self-imposed? What did he actually do as vice president? You know, Richard Nixon to me was a man who was obsessed with greatness. He worshipped Churchill and de Gaulle and Adenauer, the big men from World War II, the Marshalls and the Eisenhowers. Worshipped them. He wanted to be them. But ultimately he failed at it. He did not succeed. He trained himself to be the best, to be the great. Where is it? You tell me. Where is the greatness in his dragging out the war for 4 years, in lying to the American people, in blemishing American institutions?
When you looked at him, let me talk about the mechanics of the movie for a second. Hopkins. Why Tony Hopkins? Back to Nixon in a moment. Why Anthony Hopkins?
He's just, I think Tony Hopkins, to be honest, is in a class by himself. Just as an incredible actor, first of all. I mean, everything he does is, to me, fascinating. But in the movie Remains of the Day, I saw a side of Hopkins that was isolated and sad, and certainly the repression of feelings. And I went right away to my father, because my father resembles Nixon in many ways, too. And I was thinking that Tony Hopkins is the closest actor I know who's above 50, who has some of those characteristics and mannerisms, that crankiness and kind of sourpuss irritation that Nixon always had. I love Hopkins's face. I think it's a map of a life that, of suffering. You know, the man has suffered greatly, too, in his own way.
What did you see in Shadowlands?
Warmth, emotions. That's not Nixon to me. But what I saw in that movie was the complement. In other words, Tony Hopkins is, to me, a fully complemented actor. He has all the range to play. He can play cold, he can play warm. And if you can warm up Nixon a little bit for the purposes of a movie, a drama, you know, to allow us to see into the eyes of Richard Nixon and to see into his soul, that's a far bigger step than the real Nixon allowed, you see. Nixon never photographed, never allowed himself to be. Do you remember the photographs of Nixon walking on the beach at, was it San Clemente?
In a suit.
In his suit and his, not even taking his shoes off. This is not a man who is geared to let you in. Hopkins is, and he allows you that, you know, it's really a privilege to I mean, Tony bears his soul, and Nixon never did, so that's one reason you go with a great actor.
You believe that Nixon had a secret.
No. Secrets.
Secrets. What do you think they were? What is it that you think he was holding back?
I think he was one of the most complicated individuals. I think that he was ridden with secrets, with repressed feelings. I think that his awkwardness, all the body gestures, and Tony can act this out far better than I, suggest a man who's uncomfortable in his own skin, who never accepts himself. There's a certain amount of self-loathing in there.
No grace.
No grace, self-loathing, maybe a feeling of inadequacy, or a sense of low self-esteem. You know, all through his life, everyone talks about this unease in private. He was a very good public speaker, I mean, moderately good, but he was more comfortable with a large crowd than he was in a private conversation. So in the movie, we have many ways of looking at Nixon. We have, obviously, Pat Nixon, we thought was the greatest in. And obviously we assume a lot because we don't know the conversations they had. But through that dramatic device, that character, Joan Allen, we at least understand that even the wife, after, what, 40 years, cannot find the secret in the man. And in the one scene in the movie, she accuses him of almost wanting that secret to be revealed in a public humiliation, because it's so much to keep in over a period of your life that, in a way, isn't Nixon this strange paradigm of somebody who hides, and then explodes and lets it out, you know? I was thinking about Jimmy Morrison, and he was shy too, but he exploded in Miami concert, you know, he bared himself. There's that need for public, almost humiliation in Nixon. It's a strange, you could write psychiatric history books of this man forever. But I maintain, and my co-writers and I, that he never, the wife hauled him in, nobody got in. Nobody got in, finally, to the black hole that was Richard Nixon. He remains like Cain did before him, an enigma. So secrets, yeah, you have tons of secrets. You got Cuba, you got the Bay of Pigs, we posit something off of that. But ultimately, what is the movie about? It's a man who keeps secrets, isn't it? It doesn't matter really what the secret is. It doesn't matter what the secrets are.
It is a man that somehow is hiding something.
Yeah, precisely.
Take a look at this. This is a trailer from this film, but it gives you a sense, as we spend this hour with Oliver Stone, to take a look at a sense of this film and Hopkins and Sorvino and James Woods and others. Nixon, a film by Oliver Stone. Here it is. There it is, a trailer from Nixon, a film that's getting a lot of attention. If you don't believe people are talking about it, look at the cover of Newsweek magazine. The movie, the history, the controversy. You dedicate this film to your father.
Yeah.
Louis?
Louis Stone, yes. He was a stockbroker and a very good writer of economic issues on Wall Street, approximately 50 years.
And he was somehow Nixonian to you, in a sense he liked Nixon, he admired Nixon?
Yeah, very much so.
And he was like Nixon in a way?
In many ways, yes. I don't think he'd admit to that. I think that he was, you know, one of those Republicans, conservative, but not overly so. Was not a supporter of Goldwater. He basically, like Nixon, came from the Depression era, suffered under Franklin Roosevelt's regime, and felt that, you know, Roosevelt had been its disaster. So a lot of his republicanism was this anti-New Deal attitude that Nixon had after World War II, and they came back and they wanted another type of economy, so supported Eisenhower, and was actually given an award by Nixon, a citizenship type award. I forgot what it was. He went down to the White House. Yeah. He was, ultimately, when he got older in his life, he changed many of his opinions in the 1970s. Pentagon Papers and Watergate disgusted him, yeah, and influenced him. And he started to move away from that monolithic point of view that, you know, I'd grown up with.
You were estranged from him for a long time.
One day he came up to me, I'll never forget, he said, you know, Huck, I was wrong. Huckleberry, sometimes he called me, he said, I was wrong, you know. And he didn't say quite that way. He said, you know, what the hell? I mean, what difference does it make if they have missiles in Cuba? I mean, they can put a Russian submarine off of East Hampton. You know, it's 20 miles away. It doesn't really, you know, it seemed like the geopolitical aspect of it sort of sank in late in his life, that this nuclear war thing was an insane kind of ideology that had built up.
As you know, many people are saying, some, not many, some are saying that, you know, that in a sense they see similarity between you and Nixon.
And you, Charlie, what do you see? I'm sure you see.
Well, before what I said, let me read you what the Washington Post said, you know, and tell me whether you agree with this. It said, among American filmmakers, by far the most Nixonian is Oliver Stone. Both are smart, ruthless battlers known for their willingness to play hardball. Both are fueled by a high-octane blend of ambition and idealism. Both are good soldiers willing to lead with their chin and self-improvers who read history for its lessons. Both feel an angry contempt for the Eastern establishment and have control, freak suspicion of the press that verges on hysteria. Both are longtime insiders who feel like unappreciated outsiders. One profound difference. Nixon didn't dare show his real self, your point. Stone is free to act out his most reckless impulsive. He wears his wildness like a diamond-studded Stetson.
Who wrote that? Is that?
That was in the Washington Post. I think John Connor, maybe.
John Powers?
John Powers.
Oh, that's very well written. Like, very well written. Perhaps, yeah, I think it's very well written, and probably it's accurate. I think that I have the benefit having grown up in another generation, to express my feelings more openly than my father's generation did. I think that they sat on a lot of stuff. My father hardly even touched me physically, you know. It was very rare to get a kiss or a hug or even much encouragement. You know, or always sort of looking for approvals, much like Nixon with his own father and his mother. So it was the, you know, that I think we have the benefit of having seen our fathers' lives. Many of my generation are, you know, put it out there emotionally and try to let it out and as they, you know, not be the victim of the secret desires, but who knows?
But it clearly shaped you, this relationship with your father.
Of course, my mother too. You know, you mustn't slight her. I mean, we all are shaped by them. But if you're going to suggest that you know, this movie is my father's life instead of Richard Nixon's, I don't think that would be fair to my dad, because my father also had things that Richard Nixon didn't have. He did have a wonderful sense of humor, and he was known for it. And which is something that Nixon needed very desperately, I think. And if Nixon had had it, a little more of that Ronald Reagan thing, and letting things bounce off you and not.
You admired that immensely in Ronald Reagan, the capacity not to allow criticism to stick, that Teflon quality he had.
He was great. He was a master. He was a master. I mean, how else?
I mean, he wrote and didn't bother him. Not only didn't stick in terms of sticking in terms of other people.
Yeah, he used it well. He used the concept of public relations. I mean, it was magnificent. It's the single, you know, the only president that lasted 2 terms, really, in this era, and basically carried out his mandate.
A great president? Reagan.
In that sense, great in achieving a goal that he set out to do. Great, the greatness of his actions, what he did, will have to be judged by, you know, that's a subjective call, because you may not like his social programs or his foreign programs. I don't particularly. But you have to judge his greatness within the context of his achievement, and he achieved.
Richard Reeve wrote a piece about this in the New York Times. What did you think of that piece?
I didn't care for it.
He was on this program, and you saw him when he was on this program, because you reminded me of that. Followed by 3 critics, all of who liked your film.
Oh, good.
Well, you know that because you thought it balanced it out.
Reeves's pieces, it posits, you see, me as a bit of a straw man. I think that's what always happens in these pieces sometimes. Like, I'm the guy who's saying, hey, it's only a movie, which I never said. I defended what I'm doing as something between entertainment and fact. You know, there is something else called drama. It has existed for literally 1,000 years more, Sophocles and Antigone. I mean, you can take stories of kings and families and incest and tragedies, and you dramatize them. You enter into an arena of poetic metaphor. You try to say a greater truth sometimes than fact can bring us, or entertainment can bring us.
What's the greater truth here?
I knew you were going to lead with that one.
Well, why is that leading, Oliver? I'm not trying to be contentious. I mean, you say there's a greater truth, and I say, what is it? That's not being contentious or argumentative. It's exploring.
Well, my question, I knew you were going to lead with that one. Is that contentious?
No, okay, but go ahead. No. Well, but you know what I mean. I mean, what's the larger truth here about Richard Nixon? That he's a tragic figure. And
betrayed by himself, by his own character, was his destiny, his sense of aggrievement, his sense of revenge and paranoia brought him down, destroyed him in front of us publicly in the largest public spectacle we've probably seen in many years. It was an act of self-destruction that was enormous and shocking, but not beyond Richard Nixon's dramatic impulse, worth, is the idea that America itself is going through this with him, because he was our leader, that America's national consciousness is being seen here. And I think it makes us, you know, it gives us the ability now, 20 years after he left, to look back at this event and say, what happened? And what is its meaning in my life? So many people hate Nixon, right? They have this badge on them, I hate Nixon. And it's really part of their identity. They have it. If they lost that identity, it's the same thing as if Nixon would say, I'm sorry, or I really screwed up. I mean, if they dropped the anti-Nixon thing, and then we could start to move on and evolve into a more conscious, possibly,
There's an interesting, that interesting moment in the film, which James Wood, playing Bob Haldeman, says, if he'd only said, I screwed up, we covered up, I'm sorry.
I've always thought that,
Ehrlichman said, I don't know where you got this or whether it was made up, but there is a truth to this, because I think, well, I mean, whether they said it or not.
I was thinking, Dan Rather said this too, he knew Nixon very well. He said, I think that he, even as late as even after the second term, he could have done it. After he won the second term, sometime in '73, he could have gotten off the hook by just saying, look, this thing was a disaster, and I covered up, and I did cover up, and I was sorry I did it, but I really was trying to protect and we're trying to get through this thing, and I did screw up. But there are more important things in this country than this, and try to come cleaner. I think he would have gotten off the hook as late as '73.
How do you want people to come to this film? One, as entertainment. One, as an experience that gives them what? Ideas to think about? A new perspective on a man?
Emotions, too. Don't forget the power of cleansing, the power of catharsis. Some people who hated Nixon have told me they cried when they see the movie. They walk out and they say, I never would have thought I would have cried for that son of a bitch, but I did. And in some way, it healed me. It cleansed me of an old scar. And then, the idea is that now, that part of our life is gone forever. Can we deal with it? Can we move on? Can government move beyond this lack of trust we have in it, this disgrace it went through? I mean, these are questions we have to ask ourselves. Can we heal as a nation? Right now, I mean, look at Mr. Dole and Mr. Gingrich. Aren't they saying so much of what Nixon said in their own way? I mean, hardball politics, partisanship.
Yeah.
What about, reducing government, returning the money to the states, letting the states work it out? A lot of that is Nixon issues.
Yeah, it's one of the interesting things you'll see in the closing segment, which we will show from the film in a few minutes. It is you show after the final speech by Nixon at the White House, and when he says, the enemies only win if you hate them. That's when they've conquered you, something to that effect. And then you go to his burial.
Yeah.
And there is the President of the United States, the likely nominee of the Democratic Party, talking.
Yeah.
And then there is Robert Dole crying because he was a political mentor for him at the funeral. Which makes it somehow
What was your reaction
contemporary.
To that? What was your reaction to that funeral?
What was yours?
I asked you first.
No, tell me. I mean, why did you enclose with it? Why was that the last visual of this movie?
It was the last step of his life. He restored himself. He succeeded in what he wanted, which was to reestablish himself as an elder statesman. He wrote books and garnered most of his respect that he sought in his life. He won in his game. He won. I mean, I don't think he did, but that's what most people in the media felt, and they did it. And if you remember the funeral, it was a bit like a JFK assassination, a bit like it in the sense that it was very Orwellian in its power. You had President Clinton forgiving him, and you had a president who, I mean, in a sense, it was, the media in general didn't go deeper, didn't really bring back the memories, the disgraces of Hiss and Checkers and Watergate and Ellsberg and Chappaquiddick and they didn't go into that. It was interesting. But,
on the question of Hiss versus Chambers, who do you believe?
I met with Hiss this year. You've asked a very big question. It's a movie in and of itself, I met with Hiss last year. He was a very old man, and I was struck by the conviction that he held and the emotional intensity that he held at that age. And I must tell you, when you see people who have lived with it for so many years, like Jim Garrison, in a belief, that belief, you tend to think he means it, he has it. He has some understanding, and he has stuck to it into his near death. And I think Mr. Hiss, I do believe that he lied about knowing Chambers, but I don't believe he spied for the Soviet Union.
So Chambers lied or didn't?
I believe that Hoover played a role in this, and the Catholic priest whose name escapes me, that Nixon very much benefited from it. And I think that there is duplicity on Nixon's part. I think that he got his information from the FBI. I can't prove it. And I think that, they were in cahoots, and I think Hoover and Nixon became very close in the Hiss case.
Okay, take a look at this. This is back to the relationship. One of the things that everybody points out in this film is Mrs. Nixon. It's a brilliant performance by everybody's account. And it brings her alive, and it puts her there, and you understand. Here are two clips married together at different times that show you the relationship in this film, Richard Nixon, Patricia, Ryan Nixon. Boy, all of us wish she had talked, don't we?
Yeah. We screened the Barbara Walters, I think it was, interview. She really hardly said a thing. Very enclosed and hermetic woman.
What do her friends say?
Well, you know, we read as much as we could about it. There's not much written. Her daughter wrote a book. She's mentioned in several histories, and people talked about her. And also, there are some living people who dealt with her and we talked to. And what I only can come up with is a sense of, you know, isolation and a sense of sadness. And there was talk about drinking. And, you know, I heard stories about the dinners being pretty short and pretty silent and painful, especially towards that last year and a half, 2 years. That, you know, there'd be often, the dinner would be served in total silence. And the staff, in fact, was one of the people said it was just, he wanted to get it over with. It was so painful.
Does it disturb you that the family released a statement saying that this movie was maliciously designed to defame and degrade memories?
No, I really, I'm sad that they feel that way. I understand their distress. It's sometimes, you know, it's an uncomfortable area when a family member is also a member of history, a part of history. And, you know, you know, we have to, you know, the public sphere is more important, ultimately, than the private sphere here. In this case, he crossed the line, and Mr. Nixon. But I really wish that they would see the movie, because I think it's far more empathetic to Richard Nixon than they might think reading a script. Reading a script and making a movie, two different things. Anthony Hopkins gives it a life.
Is this movie, for you, a kind of bookend with JFK?
Yes.
How so?
Same area of American history, very much crosses the same territory, but seen from two different points of view. In fact, you could even add on and say that The Doors is its own view of that same period, too, but seen from a different prism. If you imagine a real event, a real period of our time, and you were to look at it in a 360-degree fashion, you would find characters like Ron Kovic in Born on the 4th of July, or Layli Haislip in Heaven and Earth. And you might be able to move around this central event and look at it from different sides.
Tell me what this body of work of yours is about, in your own words.
Charlie, you're very prescient, but I can't tell you because it's evolving as I speak. And each time I've seen you a few years, I've come on every couple of years or something, and I talk about another movie.
10 movies in 10 years.
10 years, and I think you've seen different phases of the moon. If you grant that consciousness, the pure act of consciousness, is like the moon. I have a place up in Colorado, and I just love to look at the moon. And sometimes it's full, sometimes it's half full, or it's just a slice, or it's not there. And sometimes our consciousness works that way. It's not like you move in a straight line to being a wiser person, but it's just it's sort of a revolving consciousness. Am I being too abstract here? But I've grown through these movies. I've learned so much about my life. And
about your life?
Yeah, and also about America and about, you know, we deal with a lot of actors when you make a film like this. You deal with a lot of extras and people, and you immerse yourself in a period, you do research, you talk to John Dean or Alex Butterfield, Howard Hunt.
Butterfield and Dean consultants to this film for you.
Yeah, and John Sears too, and John Newman and Bob Shear. I mean, we've had quite a few consultants.
What did they say to the criticisms of people like Stephen Ambrose, a historian, who spoke to this and said even where he is cited, it's an erroneous interpretation where you cite him in these footnotes in this book?
I think he'd have to be a little more specific. I'd like to know what he means, because very rarely would we cite only Ambrose. We would be citing more than one source in these things. So I can't answer the question unless it's a specific one.
Okay.
But Ambrose we find is very centrist and conservative in his historical interpretation of Nixon. And I say this knowing how respected he is in the field. But you have to look at his books, all 3 volumes we did, all 3 volumes. He knows a lot about Nixon, but nowhere does he really go into the darker areas of what Mr. Nixon might have been up to as a vice president who was very much in the foreign realm, very involved in the foreign realm.
And that's what interests you enormously?
No, not only. But my point to you is that as a historian, why doesn't he do that? There was something inherently conservative in his approach. That's my point.
Then tell me what you believe about...
That's a different question.
Okay, well, I understand. I've asked it technically. What do you believe about Richard Nixon and his knowledge of the assassination attempts by the CIA in cahoots with the mafia against Castro, and whether that led to the assassination of President Kennedy, and whether Nixon felt some grief, responsibility, not grief over the death, but grief over somehow he might have said...
Good question. Good question, and you know, it's a tough, it's a long answer, and I want to be short as much as possible, but I do believe, and we show Nixon being very, very distraught by the assassination of John Kennedy, obviously not involved in any overt way, and knowing or sensing that something else, some force is running the country, dominating the country's leadership, that there's something in control, something almost demonic. He says at one point, looking into the fire, what's helping us? Abe Lincoln, he talks to Abe Lincoln. Is it God or is it death? Nixon had to be obsessed with death. Two of his younger brothers died. He loved those brothers, I believe, and I think their loss devastated him in life. And then the Kennedy brothers died. Jack Kennedy cleared the way in his own way for Nixon's ascendancy. And Robert Kennedy, if he had not died, I believe would have won the 1968 election. So death played a very important part in Richard Nixon's life. And you have Nixon saying, when Robert Kennedy lay dying on a hotel room kitchen floor, he knew at that moment he'd be president. Now, that's obviously a...
Explain that. I mean, that's obviously a dramatic license to make a point that Nixon somehow, in your judgment, believed that because of the deaths only he became president, because the Kennedy brothers died.
He was a major power player, Nixon. He knew the mathematics. I think he understood that Robert Kennedy had a lot of charisma, had a very strong anti-war emotional vote going, and he was in trouble. So that's the basis of our speculation, intuition, call it.
But tell me...
But I want to go back, because you say, you know, what was haunting him, and I can't presume to tell you that I know the secrets of Richard Nixon. However, I do believe that, along with J. Edgar Hoover and people like Helms, Nixon knew a lot more than was apparent. And he
about what?
About, let's just say across the board. In every department of government, I think he knew a hell of a lot more than he ever let on. He was a man, by all accounts, who could go into a budget meeting and break down a budget. This is a serious, a man who knew detail and had a good grasp of policy and how it was shaped. He spent 8 years under Eisenhower, 8 years as vice president. He was in charge. He was fascinated by Cuba. He went there many times, condemned Castro after his meeting with him as a communist, and in 1959 and 1960 was, you know, in charge of the special project on Cuba inside the White House. He came into contact with numerous people who were setting up the paramilitary operations that were done to attack Cuba. Are you with me?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Okay, they called it Track 1.
And what about Track 2?
Track 2 was a natural offshoot of Track 1. It was called, as part of the invasion plan, it was to assassinate the head of government, Castro. And that was put into effect before Kennedy, under the Eisenhower regime. Nixon has plausible deniability. There is no question. But do you really think in 1959 Allen Dulles would have signed an order countenancing the assassination of Castro and operated totally off the shelf without Nixon or Eisenhower's permission? It's not too far for me to suggest no in my movie. Particularly as, several years later, when Nixon is president, he repeatedly mentions on the tape of June 20 and June 23 the concept of Cuba and the concept of the Bay of Pigs, the Bay of Pigs thing. This is after Hunt is arrested. Hunt goes back to his Cuban days. He knew Hunt through Cushman, who was his aide. I didn't know a lot of names. But the point is, as vice president, this man who traveled the whole world and knew Allen Dulles very well was not just an innocent. He had to be given plausible deniability by the CIA in this event. I mean, that was the way they functioned. Helms admitted as much in 1978 that they would never implicate a leader in something like this.
Well, it is also said that, I've read this, I think this might have been in Newsweek, I don't know, but where I read this, that Helms hired a lawyer and that in a sense caused you to back off from making some...
No, not at all.
You've read that, though, have you not?
No,
that Helms had a lawyer and that you...
I received a letter from Helms' lawyer, absolutely. I remember the letter. It was, you know, threatening and all that, but we received letters like that frequently. No, it was dealt with by an insurance company. It would have been easily put in a movie. I shot the scene. I cut the scene for length. It just because it was a good scene, but it ultimately didn't...
What's the purpose of the scene with John Dean and Howard Hunter, who nobody, and John Dean would have told you this, never happened, on a bridge? What's the point of that scene, which people point to a lot?
We're condensing material here.
Right.
I mean, you grant that Howard Hunt blackmailed the president successfully, and he was paid off. We know that. Yes, you grant that.
I don't grant that, because, I mean, tell me how we know he blackmailed the president.
Well, a lot of the Watergate tapes, the reasons that he was impeached was because he, Nixon, proved the payoffs to Hunt. You see.
Right.
So in these conversations, with these transcripts that finally came out to the public light, we have Nixon agreeing to pay off Hunt to keep his silence. So the payoffs were made. We know that. That's a fact. It was done. Dean handled the payoffs, but he did not meet directly with Hunt, but he handled them through third parties, such as Coulson. The question is, do you introduce a third party like Coulson so late in the film in order to make a payoff?
So the objective reality of that is for you.
But the objective reality is correct because Hunt got paid. He successfully blackmailed the White House. I took dramatic license to show the potential, the central problem of the issue was what John Dean would stay loyal to the president. That was the key turning point in his, Nixon would have gotten away with it unless John Dean had buckled. And something was bugging John Dean. It was the Hunt business. And we dealt with it on the bridge.
This is, I think, back to Richard Reeves. Take a look at this tape, which is about some of the issues we were talking about. Here it is, Richard Reeves on this broadcast referred to earlier.
There is, I'm not a great Oliver Stone fan, but there's a wonderful made-up scene in the movie where Nixon is standing in front of a portrait of Kennedy and saying, you know, they loved him, why not me? And Pat Nixon comes up behind him and says, they loved him because he was lovable.
Yeah, but isn't there also a scene, which I haven't seen in the movie, I say, but in which he says, Nixon looks at a picture of Kennedy and he says, you represent what they want to be, I represent what they are.
That was a good line. Oliver Stone is Nixon. Nixon and Oliver Stone, as far as I can tell, see the world pretty much the same way.
The film is dedicated to Oliver Stone's father,
who went bankrupt on Wall Street. Right. And Stone hates Wall Street and the Ivy League and money and the establishment and then the system. So they're both paranoid, actually. Yeah. But he had a moving scene, which I think comes from his life, not from Richard Nixon, in which Nixon is kind of blubbering about losing the 1960 election and having stolen the votes in Texas, the votes in Chicago, saying, you had everything, why did you steal the only thing I had? I think that's Oliver Stone. I don't think that's the Richard Nixon that I knew.
Is that Oliver Stone? Did you understand that?
No, he was known to complain. He thought about a recount in 1960. In fact, he almost went to a recount. They pulled him out of it. He says one thing in his memoirs, other people say other things, but essentially, if he had asked for the recount and it would have not only stalled the country for 6 months, but it would have finished him politically if he'd been in any way wrong. And he didn't have the action. It was a big move. He couldn't do it.
What is true,
but he complained a lot about losing. In fact, Kennedy shaped his sense that Kennedy had stolen the election. It justified in his mind the concept of upping the dirty tricks game, you know. You can pretty much, means to an end, you know, cut corners if necessary.
There's a scene in the film, in fact, with J. Edgar Hoover at a racetrack in which you see him, Richard Nixon, saying to Hoover, I'm not going to let him steal it again.
That's right. That's right. And
because he felt like they'd stolen it in Chicago and they'd stolen it.
By all accounts, all historical accounts, Nixon had a much tougher 68-72 campaign than he did in 1960. Yeah. If anything, he was called a little soft in 1960.
You acknowledge these references in these comparisons in the Washington Post between you and Richard Nixon. I mean, Dick Reeves there says paranoid, hates Yale, hates Wall Street, hates the American system. These
are simplifications. I'm a different type personality than. That's a simplistic version of me. I don't think Richard Nixon would ever have made films like Born on the 4th of July, you see. I'm very compassionate and loving and caring about America, and I think that Richard Reeves forgets that, you know, dissident thought is allowable in this country. And that
What's dissident thought?
It's, I suppose you could call it unofficial history, shadows of history. You call it anti-establishment thinking.
And you were saying with Jim Garrison and with some interpretations of Nixon and what he may or may not have known about Cuba and what it may or may not have led to, you were saying to America, this is my movie, this is my Nixon. Because a lot of people say, this is not historic Nixon, this is the reason I wrote this, the introduction the way I did. This is Oliver Stone's Nixon. This is the way Oliver Stone saw Nixon. This is the filmmaker's Nixon. He wants to put it out there as worthy of consideration and worthy of discussion about a central figure in America and about secrets, about conspiracies, about flaws, about tragic, about possibilities of greatness denied by those qualities.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you could say it's a Nixon. You know, it's not, we never said this is a definitive Nixon, but we did enormous amount of research. And you know, what a drama is well-documented research, but combined with intuition to go behind closed doors and into secret meetings and to take licenses with them based on research. I would argue with Mr. Reeves on every single point in both JFK and Nixon, and I think that you should be looking at Mr. Reeves a little bit more critically. He wrote a book about John Kennedy where, you know, he assails his character repeatedly,
yeah,
and he ignores the assassination. And I mean, I think he basically deals with it in a few pages, and he never even raises the possibility of conspiracy to murder him or motive.
Yeah.
And I'm saying there's something lacking when you do not look to those shadows. I mean, why does it require a filmmaker to question this and be berated for it when historians should be doing this? Bear in mind, when I brought to the forefront with the JFK movie, it was not original material, Charlie. It was all material that had been around since the 1960s. It was a growing body of evidence from people from all over the country that had assembled this evidence in opposition to the Warren Commission. It was not original material. I don't know why it was treated as if it were.
But, Oliver, this is not a new point of view to you, that most people, the majority, let me finish, the majority of people believe that you placed way too much credence on Jim Garrison. And that's a fair and reasonable statement to say, and I believe that.
You could argue that.
Okay. I mean, and you want to say, look, here's what Jim Garrison believed, and this is the whole soul of my movie, and here's a Warren Commission, a lot of other people, you know, and even what's maybe halfway in between.
Yeah.
Warren Commission may not have gotten it right, but the alternative and the best theory may not be Jim Garrison, and Jim Garrison may have done a lot of things that were more flawed than any other interpretation, including the Warren Commission.
Yes.
Okay.
No, no, not the last thing. I think the Warren Commission was
more flawed than Jim Garrison
in many ways.
Okay.
I mean, the fact that they didn't get...
Let me go to this, because I want to show this is your film, and this is about this movie. This is Richard Nixon showing you another aspect of him and the brilliance of Anthony Hopkins as Nixon, Paul Sorvino as Kissinger, and James Woods as Haldeman, and others. Here it is. We're near the end of this hour. There is also a character played by Larry Hagman.
Yeah.
Conservative, right-wing, Texas, oil. Mm-hmm. What's the point? What are you saying there?
Well, actually, if you examine the scene, the implication is that they're really fed up with Kennedy, and they were. The oil depletion allowance had knocked out a lot of their earning power. And you have to look at Nixon's past. I mean, he was supported early on in his life by California rich men, and he formed a new coalition of allies in the Southwest. So he had money men behind him all his life. In fact, the Checkers crisis was about, the slush fund was about that. People like Clint Murchison, Howard Hunt, the other Hunt, and were always
there. There's nothing to indicate
life.
that somehow they were financing the assassination.
Oh, yeah. No, they didn't. There's no indication in the movie of that. No,
I just want to make sure that
certainly you have to look at the connection between, you know, rich Texans, Dallas, the anti-Cuban Castro, the anti-Castro forces, and the financing that went to them. And you have to ask yourself, who put up the money for a lot of that stuff?
We're out of time. I thank you, Oliver, for coming and spending this hour with me. We will see as we go out the last scene of this film, which is the resignation speech. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, John.
Pleasure.